dealing with the sexual habits of cockroaches, you'll add, and the impact of climate.
So all I have to do is add a little wrinkle to my grant application to explain how, well, I'm worried that climate change will mean the death of all the maple trees. And so right away you qualify for funding.
Academics of every kind lined up for climate funding. Climate became an exciting new area of interest for sociologists, biologists, professors of English literature, lecturers in gender studies, and many more.
And it also served to create a community. I mean, you know, you've become a climate scientist now, even though you know nothing about the physics of climate.
Thousands of papers were published on climate change and prostitution, climate change and beer, climate change and the Black Death, climate change and disability, climate change and video games, and everything else imaginable.
There's an almost comical list of studies out there. Just do a Google search on climate change and everything comes up.
Few of these papers ever questioned whether climate change was actually true.
After you've done the research and you write the paper up, sometimes you'll find there's no effect at all from climate, but you still have to say in your papers, oh yes, climate change is real, and we just need to study this some more.
Since so few of these so-called climate studies challenged the idea of climate change, it was declared that there was a scientific consensus. Climate change must be true. Climate also became a new focus for government-funded research bodies.
Scientific research in the United States tends to be dominantly funded by government grants. And so whatever government grants are offered sort of determine much of the science being done.
It was during the Cold War that many government research bodies were set up. But the end of the Cold War and pressure on government spending has left many of them struggling to justify their continued funding.
United States Congress only funds problems, okay? Research into problems, whether it's money that goes to NASA or NOAA or National Science Foundation or Department of Energy or any other alphabet soup, organization.
It's always been a problem to support your research or your existence, or raison d'etre. And so climate was a godsend.
If Congress is willing to pay you to find evidence of global warming, by golly, as a scientist, we're going to go find evidence of it, because that's what we're being paid to do. And guess what? If you don't find evidence or say the evidence suggests it's not a problem, your funding ends. This totally corrupts the way we look at the science.
Who was the famous gangster asked, "Why do you rob banks?" And he said, "Well, because that's where the money is."
The climate alarm brought funds, and the bigger the supposed threat, the more funds seemed to flow. The publicly funded science establishment now had a direct financial interest in playing up the alarm.
So there's a huge incentive to over-exaggerate or to speak in hyperbole, even if the data doesn't support exactly what you're saying, because that's what brings the funds. I was in that boat. I was someone that was defending climate change as a grad student quite a bit, because the truth is I didn't give it too much thought, but I thought, well, it's getting a ton of attention. It brings a ton of money into the earth sciences. Even if I don't buy all the hyperbole, what's the problem?
By the late 1990s, what had started as an environmental scare story was gaining momentum. Western governments and their senior civil servants were more than willing to address the climate problem. Green taxes were levied, green regulation expanded, and this in turn generated more climate-related jobs and activity.
Take the banking sector, for instance. You say to a banker, we want you to file reports with the Regulatory Commission on how climate change is going to affect your bank. Well, a banker doesn't know anything about this subject, so then they have to commission studies from academics. And of course, the academics are happy to come and tell them, well, it's going to be terrible for your bank. It's going to cause all kinds of problems, and you need to give us money to research this.
Green subsidies and regulation meant there was now money to be made in climate. Renewables firms sprouted. Consultancy firms offered advice on what they called sustainability and climate compliance.
It's a wonderful business opportunity, okay? You want climate, we'll give you climate.
The renewables industry alone now turns over $1 trillion a year, and that's expected to double in the next few years.
What used to be a cottage industry is now blossomed to become a major part of the world economy.
The growth of this climate industry has seen an explosion of highly paid green jobs. Chief sustainability officers, carbon offset advisors, ESG consultants, climate compliance lawyers, and countless others.
Students started to come into our departments as earth science departments with a focus on climate. That never happened before. But they started to look at their career prospects, and they were smart, and they were looking at who's hiring. And the fact of the matter is that everything in the hiring pool had climate somewhere attached to the name.
I started a few years ago seeing programs like a master's degree in climate finance. And I just went, what on earth is climate? I understand what a master's degree in finance is. Well, now you need a university that's going to teach this program. You need professors of climate finance.
Every single school or university or business will have a climate officer or climate officers and a climate program. And you look at any of these institutions or businesses, you will find they all are signed up to it, and anyone who hasn't signed up will come under pressure.
At the last gathering of the publicly funded UN's IPCC, 70,000 delegates flew in from around the world. Government bureaucrats, green NGOs, carbon sequestration consultants, environmental journalists, heads of renewables companies. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Many hundreds of thousands of jobs worldwide now depend on the climate crisis.
You start building this enormous population whose job is to manage the crisis, and also explicitly to make sure that people are alarmed about the crisis, because this whole industry depends on the existence of the crisis.
But therein lies the one great threat to this multi-trillion-dollar industry. All the jobs, all of the funding are totally dependent on there being a climate crisis.
If CO2 isn't having the huge negative impacts that we claimed it was having originally, how are we going to stay in business? How do we justify our existence if climate change isn't this existential threat that we claimed it was over the last 4 decades or so?
People like me, our careers depend on funding of climate research. This is what I've been doing just about my whole career. This is what the other climate researchers are doing with their whole career. They don't want this to end.
If NASA said global warming's not a problem, where does their funding disappears, right? So they can't say that. I mean, you've got the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. If they said the climate isn't changing, they'd have no reason to exist.
The IPCC has a self-preservation instinct to show that climate change is an existential threat. Otherwise, there's no reason for them to be collecting the money and doing the work in the first place.
There are not just now billions, but there are trillions of dollars at stake.
There's a huge amount of money involved. This is a huge, big money scam. A lot of people's livelihoods depend on it. They're not going to give that up.
If suddenly the notion becomes apparent that this is not such a problem, you're going to see that as an existential threat.
Scientists who studied the natural causes of climate change began to be viewed with suspicion, as 2 Harvard astrophysicists discovered.
How much does the sun change, and how does it change, and why does it change? And then we didn't even want to get into the temperature record, the climate thing. Immediately they will come after, because when we started to estimate that the sun changed by quite significantly in terms of climatic sense, immediately the attack is there. Because it's not following the narrative, because they need the CO2 to be the only one, the only dominant player.
When you tried to say, well, gee, we're just looking for the background of natural variability, the response would be, we can't have natural changes as an effect. It has to be human caused. And some of that was directly stated, but most of it was indirect. your funding for this kind of project will be dropped. This kind of project doesn't go anywhere.
By that time, anything that contradicted the narrative of global warming as a serious problem was not going to get funded.
Editors of academic journals came under pressure not to accept papers which were deemed to be skeptical of the climate crisis.
We will not publish anything that questions this. I mean, it's not something surreptitious.
Scientists who dared to point out in public that there was no climate chaos began to be sidelined and shunned.
If a scientifically qualified person stands up and says, we don't see an upward trend in the data on Pacific typhoons, well, suddenly they lose standing to address the topic of Pacific typhoons, not because what they said is wrong, but because it's off message. They can marginalize any kind of criticism of the narrative by saying, you're not qualified to talk about this because you don't support the narrative. That is then, and then having marginalized everyone who doesn't support the narrative, they can turn around and say, well, everybody who counts supports the narrative, so we must be right.
Environmental journalists ignored skeptics and instead offered headlines to anyone prepared to make the most outrageous claims and predictions about a climate apocalypse.
It's gotten to where it has nothing to do with the science anymore. It doesn't matter if your alarmist prediction doesn't come true, you're still going to retain your status as an expert, and the media is still going to come and ask you for your opinion, even though you were crazy wrong about your predictions.
But the consensus on climate is not only enforced by those in the climate industry. To explain the broader appeal of the climate alarm, we must look at the politics behind climate. From the start, the climate scare was political. It came from the environmental movement, the sworn enemy of free market industrial capitalism.
Finally, we've got them. We can claim that it is the free markets who are destroying the planet, and we need big government to save us.
The climate problem, it is said, stems from the irresponsible actions of greedy, feckless individuals.